Hey channel, this is Fernando from SkyFi Audio. Today I've got something super interesting, the Nakamichi 1000 ZXL cassette deck. This is the king daddy of all Nakamichi cassette decks. It is a monster in size, in design, execution, and by far one of the most desirable Nakamichi decks in market. This particular piece came to us broken, as many Nakamichis do. It is in need of some tender loving care. Quite a bit of it, as a matter of fact. As you can see, the display is completely pinned out. None of the buttons here are lit up. We suspect it's got some issues with the power supply. It's probably going to need a full service of the drive system, but I'll go a bit more into that later. Let me give you a quick overview, and I've also opened it up so we can take a look at inside the 1000 CXL and see what makes it so special. So this model was made in the 70s. As you can see from the look of it, it really looks 1970s vintage. It is sizable. It is, probably 10 inches tall, while most cassette decks, including the Dragon and the CR7, would have been maybe 60% of the size of it. And it's a welcome thing for us technicians. Size means room inside. We've got plenty of room to access drives, boards, connections, etc., etc. The Dragon is a bear to work on, but this unit seems to have quite a bit more space within it. Most notably in the front panel are the slider switches. That's very 1970s. Instead of potentiometers, they just slide up and down. A bit more precise than a potentiometer, but essentially the same function, just linearly instead of a rotary Y. So late 1970s, I think the last ones were made in early 80s, maybe 81. There was a gold version, which is also extremely desirable. Throughout the years, the only cosmetic change besides the gold one would have been the finish. It went from a matte black to more of a glossy black. Seems to be an earlier model. So technically pretty advanced. The Dragon is a bit more capable, mostly because it does auto reversing. It can actually play both sides of the tapes. This machine only plays one side at a time, so you've got to flip the tape manually. But very similar in execution. I see the drive system shares a lot of components with the Dragon. It is in fact a 4-motor and a 3-head machine, and I'll tell you what all that means. 4 motors means that we've got inside the drive itself motors controlling 4 different things. One is the cap stand, the second is the rollers or the reel, then the record azimuth, which is the tilt of the head for recording, and cam control, which engages all the heads. So 4 motors, which is pretty high motor count, and 3 heads, one for record, one for playback, and one for erase. And that's what separates the good from the best in terms of tape decks. Having separate record and playback heads allows you to monitor your recording as it's happening real time. So this is a switch here that allows you to kind of switch between listening on your headphones or your stereo, between the tape itself or the source that's being fed into it. So you can flip this and compare live and real time your program material versus your recorded material, so you can adjust. It is an auto azimuth machine, and this is where a lot of these boards come into play. It's pretty high and technically advanced for its time. It uses quite a bit of logic circuits in order to auto azimuth your tape, or essentially set the machine up for the best performance possible. So that would be done through a push of a button here, auto calibration. It is packed with 2 features, 2 acronyms that they refer to. One is ABLE, which is what I was just mentioning, azimuth, bias, level, and EQ. So when you press these buttons, the ABLE feature comes into play, and it does all those things automatically for you. The second advanced thing that also uses a separate board is the RAM. RAM is essentially this technology that allows you to, in a dead space between songs, in about 3 seconds, store information about the tape itself, both the playback, the EQ, and the noise reduction. So the machine kind of knows what is up with that tape and how it should set itself. So it records digitally, well, it records into the dead spaces information that it needs, much like a DAT tape would, 10 years later or 15 years later. All right, so at the top we've got this really cool display. Sorry for the glare. Maybe at this angle is better. Here are some bias indications, level, EQ. A lot of these lights are not lit right now. It's got a really long numerical indication here for the RAM that I just mentioned. It's got a digital counter and the fluorescent meter, which is obviously pinned out and not set properly. This is a great VU meter. It's used on a bunch of decks from this era, and I really dig it because it has the ability to kind of like switch itself into a couple modes. Let me go over the front panel layout, then we'll take a look at the inside, and then we'll take a look at the back as well, which is also pretty impressive. On the front, we've got some simple things like the pitch control, not found on consumer tape decks, but like semi-pro tape decks would have a pitch control to allow you to change the speed. Obviously, the eject button's there, and then your control buttons, really cool large buttons. And if this machine were working properly, these buttons would be lit up in an outline with different colors. So pause, record, forward and rewind, stop and play are right here. Power buttons here, our timer between record and play. Memory, whether we want to enable the memory functions, are here between stop and play as well. Test tone, this is for calibration used. It generates a 400 Hertz signal. The bias set, the EQ, enabling and disabling filters for both MPX and subsonic. You would use subsonic if you were to record a record, and you would use MPS if you were to record from radio stations. So both of them just filter out specific frequency ranges which are present, which you wouldn't want in your recording itself. Noise reduction, we've got an ability to enable noise reduction both internally in the machine and externally through some connections in the back. Here's the VU meter functions I mentioned before that lets you switch the meter between different modes. And lastly, the monitor button for selecting whether you're listening to the tape or you're listening to the source. Critical button here for this tape deck. Here's the auto calibrate. Now this runs that system of azimuth, bias level, and EQ calibration. And the memory that we were talking about with four presets. All right, up top we see the buttons for the RAM, and then the counter reset here as well, which doesn't seem to be working either. So pretty interesting layout. Output for sliders, this is your left and right outputs, your line inputs. This would be your recording level, and as you can see, you can kind of set them individually as you would display on the meter as you set the correct line input. And then microphones. This is unusual for a tape deck, but not that unusual for a tape deck from the 70s, which is left and right microphone inputs and the blend slider as well. And I'll show you these in the back. All right, switching around, spinning over, we've got quite a few connections on a tape deck that we wouldn't normally see, including these three microphone inputs, which we just showed you the sliders for. And this set of 4 inputs and outputs are for external encoders and external noise reduction systems. So